Hey everyone, it's Kristen from k.becca, and in this video I'll show you how easy it is to create layered stencils from a single layer cut file. I have my stencil SVG cut file open here in Silhouette Studio, and I'll have a link below if you're interested in purchasing this file. I'm using Silhouette Studio 4.1 Designer Edition for this project. So the stencil has the leaves and berries all on a single layer, and I'm going to take the original file and turn it into a layered stencil by separating the leaves and berries into two layers. First, I'll click the file to select it, and while it's selected, I'll go over to the menu on the right side of the screen and click to open the Modify panel. Under the Compound Paths section in the Modify panel, I'll click Release to release the paths. And you can see after I do that every shape that's a cutout area on the stencil is converted into its own shape, and little boxes appear around all of the newly created shapes. Next, I'll click somewhere outside the cut file area to deselect everything. Then I'll go over to the menu on the left side of the screen and click the Draw Shape option, and I'll draw a square in one of the corners of the stencil. This will be our registration mark, and you want it in an area where it won't interfere with the design, so a corner is usually the best option. I'm just going to make a single registration mark for this project, but you can make additional marks in other corners of the stencil for added precision, which is very helpful for more complex designs. I want to bring my registration mark square a little bit further away from the edge of the stencil, so I'll just nudge it up and to the right a little bit. After that, I'll click on the artboard and drag to select everything, and then I'll press Ctrl+Command+C to copy it, then Ctrl+Command+V to paste the copy. While the copy is selected, I'll drag it over to the side here so it's not overlapping any of the original file. The first layer of the stencil will be the layer with just the leaves, so I'll select all of the berries on that layer by pressing Shift while clicking around until all of the berries are selected. Once all of the berries are selected, I'll click Backspace on my keyboard to delete them. You want to make sure that you don't move the registration mark at all during this process. Now that the first layer of our stencil is finished, I'll click and drag to select all of the shapes on this layer, and then I'll press Ctrl+Command+G to group everything together. Next, I'll drag the leaves layer over to the side, and then I'll go over and click and drag to select all of the shapes in the layer that's going to be our berry layer, and then I'll drag it onto the white area of the artboard. You can work with it where it was, but I just think it's easier to see everything against the white background. This time, we're going to press Shift while clicking to select all of the leaves, and after they're all selected, we'll press Backspace on our keyboard to delete them, again making sure that we don't move the registration mark at all during this process. I'll click and drag to select all of the shapes for the berry layer, and then I'll press Ctrl+Command+G to group everything together. And now we're finished creating our layered stencil. You can make stencils with many more layers than we're making for this project. For example, I could split each of these layers into 2 layers to make a stencil with 4 layers. If you want to make a more complex stencil with many layers, it's just as simple as making a 2-layer stencil. You just want to make sure that your registration mark or marks remain in the exact same place on each layer. Before I cut my stencil layers, I want to double check and make sure that the registration marks are in exactly the same place on both layers. To do this, I'll drag the leaf layer back onto the artboard, click and drag across both layers to select them, then go over to the menu on the right side of the screen and click to open the Transform panel. I'll click to align the 2 layers horizontally first, then vertically, and you can see that everything lines up exactly, which is just what we want. I'll drag the leaf layer over to the side, and now I'm ready to start cutting my stencil. I'll click the Send tab at the top right of the screen, and I'll make sure that Action is set to Cut and that the tool is set to Auto Blade, since that's what I'm using. I'll be cutting my stencil from Duralar, and I typically use a cut depth of 6 and do 2 passes for this material. If my blade is on the dull side, I'll adjust that up to a cut depth of 7 or sometimes even 8 so it cuts cleanly. I'll send the first layer to cut on my Cameo, and then I'll cut the second layer on a second piece of Duralar. I'll see you over on the craft mat when the cutting is finished. Okay, so everything is finished cutting, and you can see when I line both layers up at the registration marks that they line up perfectly. And one of the great things about cutting your own stencils using the Duralar is that you end up with really pretty cutout shapes like these leaves that you can use as vellum-like embellishments for your projects. I want you to see the layered stencil in action, so I've cut a piece of white cardstock to 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches, and we'll be using the stencil to make the background for a card. The first thing that I'm going to do is to temporarily adhere the cardstock to my craft mat so it doesn't move around while I'm working. So I'll add a couple of pieces of this removable double-sided tape to the back of the cardstock to temporarily adhere it to my craft mat. If you don't have this type of tape, then you can also tape it down using washi tape or painter's tape on the front side of the card. I like using the removable tape on the back because it doesn't get in the way of the stencil at all. Next, I'll place the leaf layer of the stencil over the cardstock where I want it, and I'll place a small piece of Post-it tape underneath the registration mark area. If you don't have Post-it tape, you can use another type of tape. Just make sure that you'll be able to see the registration mark after it's inked on whatever tape or material you use. After that, I'll tape the stencil in place with painter's tape. You can also use washi tape or any low-tack tape for this. For the stencil background, I'm going with a tone-on-tone purple color scheme, so I'll be using Seedless Preserves and Milled Lavender Distress Inks. And I'll be using foam finger daubers to apply the color. After tapping my dauber onto the Milled Lavender ink pad to load it with ink, I'll stencil it onto the cardstock using a tapping motion. Oftentimes I'll use circular rubbing motions while I'm stenciling, but the leaf shapes have a lot of pointed corners that could get pulled up if I used a circular motion here. Circular motions will work much better in the leaf areas, but in the branch areas and thinner areas of the stencil, I'll use the tapping motion. I'm not worrying about getting even coverage with the ink since I want a look that's not even throughout, something that has more of like a fuzzy, lightly sponged texture. I'll continue stenciling the ink on all of the leaf areas, reloading the foam dauber as needed. And I definitely don't want to forget to ink the registration mark too. I actually should have done this first thing, but to be honest, I forgot. It's not a big deal though, as long as it gets inked at some point before the stencil is removed. After I'm finished stenciling this layer, I'll remove the painter's tape and stencil, and my cardstock will stay in place since it's taped on the back. Then I'll come in with the berry layer of the stencil and line up the registration mark right over top of the registration mark that I inked on the first layer. Then I'll just reuse the painter's tape from the first layer to tape the second layer in place. For this layer, I'll be using the Seedless Preserves Distress Ink, so I'll get a clean dauber and ink that up before applying it to the stencil. Again, I'll use a tapping motion to apply the ink, but circular motions would work as well since we're dealing with round shapes and no pointy corners on this layer. After I'm finished stenciling this layer, I'll remove the painter's tape and stencil, and then I'll carefully lift the cardstock from the craft mat and peel the removable tape off the back. And now our card background is finished. To make the card base, I've cut a piece of white cardstock to A2 size, which is a standard 8.5 by 11 inch piece of cardstock that's been cut in half lengthwise. I'll add adhesive to the front of the top folding base using a double-sided adhesive runner, and then I'll line the stenciled background up over top and press in place to adhere. Then I'll stamp one of the sentiments from the Pretty Pink Posh Thoughtful Greetings stamp set onto a piece of white cardstock that I've cut to a little larger than the sentiment. And I'm using Ranger Archival Jet Black ink for this. I'll cut some foam adhesive strips for the back of the sentiment to pop it up a little, and at the last minute I decided to add a few of the Duralar leaf cutouts from the stencil to embellish the card, so I carefully lifted part of one of the pieces of the foam tape and placed the stems for 2 leaves between the foam tape and the cardstock, pressing the foam tape back in place after to adhere the leaves in place. I'll peel the protective paper from the foam tape and adhere the sentiment in place at the bottom right of the card front, and to finish, I'll use clear glue to glue a third leaf in place to balance out the other leaves. You can find a full list of supplies used in this video in the description area below, or in the area below the video if you're watching on k.becca.com. I hope that you found this video to be helpful, and if you'd like to see more DIY stencil videos, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll tune in again soon.